way, but in other ways, you really need the encouragement, the validation. We all do. So yes, I'm pleased and excited and trying not to think all the time about whether I will or not win it.
I'm delighted to see so many of you joining us here this evening for the Walter Scott Prize Shortlist Spotlight. If you're just joining us, again, we are here with Andrew Greig. He is the author of Rose Nicholson, which has just been shortlisted for this year's prize. Andrew was previously shortlisted in 2014 for Fair Helen. Andrew, it seems that late 16th century Scotland has a particular hold on your imagination. What is going on in Scotland at this time that has so seized you as a writer that you want to devote your time to it?
Well, I think it's because it was such a riven society. It was divided pretty much down the middle. In this case, in religious and civil grounds. It was very unstable. Half the population distrusted the other half of it, and the politics were grubby and deeply unstable, and it felt very like the 21st century.
So we have a king, but he's a child king. Just for people who aren't familiar with the political state of Scotland at this time, describe that parlous state. What is going on that makes it so unstable?
Okay, what's going on is the king is about 10 months old, and his mother, the Queen, has resigned and is in England for her own safety, Mary Queen of Scots, that is. So the king is much too young to rule, and the supporters in Scotland, some of them are supporting the Queen, who want her to come back and bring back Catholicism, and the other half want the regent, who rules on behalf of the king, to carry the day and enforce the Scottish Reformation. It's a civil war. I mean, it's like the Balkans, it's like Sarajevo, it's like Ukraine. It's a very unstable place to be.
So we hear a lot about the Reformation itself, the Protestant Reformation, but not quite so much about the Scottish Reformation. But it happened quite quickly, didn't it? That switch over from a Catholic country to a Protestant,
Yeah.
like that.
Yes, it did. It happened in one day. I mean, it'd been leading up to it for about 2 years of riots and sacking of churches and stuff. But it was the one day that the Parliament met and passed the abolition of the Catholic Mass, the setting up of the Scottish Church, and every parish in Scotland had to build a school because literacy was its primary value. Everybody had to be able to read scripture to make up their mind for themselves. And this is radical stuff. I mean, yeah.
So the fact that it was declared that there had to be a school in every part of Scotland, did that have any effect on your decision to choose Rose Nicholson, who is, if you haven't read the book yet, she's a fisherwoman, a young fisher girl living in Fife, and she's quite educated, isn't she? Talk a bit about that.
Okay, well, yeah, she's possible rather than just an act of wishful thinking in my part, that she'd been educated up to the age of 13, largely in Latin, and that's how the school works. Her brother is at the university, a few years older than her, so she's been kind of sitting at his side, picking this stuff up. And it turns out that she is actually considerably smarter, more intelligent than her brother, in fact, than pretty much anybody roundabout who understands that, including our Will Fowler, who's quite in love with her. It takes him a while to realize that she is actually light years ahead of anybody else there. So, but if that wouldn't have been possible if it hadn't been for the education system that made it feasible, that an ordinary young working class girl could be properly educated.
If for all of you watching live, if you have read Rose Nicholson or if you haven't and you want to ask questions to the author, please do let us know your questions about Rose Nicholson. Andrew, I have a question before we go to our questions, which is obviously the Walter Scott Prize is named for the poet and novelist Walter Scott. Can you talk a bit about what impact Walter Scott's work had on you in particular?
Well, I suppose it above all introduced me to the historical novel. My father had lots of Scott, very hefty tomes on his shelves, and he insisted that I started reading at least one of them. Rob Roy I started with, and an excerpted long story called Thrawn Janet, which I loved. Thrawn Janet uses wonderful use of Scots. Walter Scott really knew his stuff. I mean, he was a borderer through and through, and his ancestor was in fact the Walter Scott in my book, who again is a real person, the so-called First Lord Scott, was a direct ancestor of our Walter Scott, and who is also predecessor of current Duke of Buccleuch, who is Richard Scott.
Right.
It's an extraordinary consistency.
So we have this book starts in 1574. Of course, our Walter Scott Prize of the Walter Scott Prize is 1800s, but they are connected through the clan of Scott, which is of course a traditional clan in the Borders. Again, for people who may be watching, who may not be familiar with the Borders region of Scotland, between Scotland and England, can you talk a bit about the Borders itself and the Border ballads?
Yeah, well, the Border ballads were first collected by Walter Scott in the minstrelsy of the Scottish border. And all of them are praise poems of people who fight and raided across the border between England and Scotland. It's quite martial stuff, but it's often quite funny as well. I did these at school and really, really liked them because they weren't the kind of poetry that I was expecting it to be. They're very, say, stirring, and they speak out loud extremely well. But I really got interested through them in the border reivers, who were the people both sides of English and Scotland borders, who for about 250 years, it was the Wild West. They raided cattle, sheep, and kidnapped people, and extortion and blackmail. The word blackmail comes from the Scots reivers, as does the word gang. It's just the Scots for people, a gang.
All right.
And they basically got on horses and crossed the border at night and reived, that's to say thieved, and back again. So it's extremely romantic and extremely deadly and very chaotic. I mean, it's a shambles. The whole place is half burned, but it gave rise to these wonderful poems. And once I started reading about it, I thought, I really want to do something with this. I want to be on horseback at night, sneaking across the border with my crossbow.
And of course, today, I mean, North Berwick is in Scotland, and Berwick is in England. So it's you can see how the border has been quite a movable feast over this time.
The border was deeply unstable, and it was contested a great deal. But the whole situation between England and Scotland was extremely contested, and the borderlands were just largely unmapped because it was too dangerous to go and map them. Say, for about 250 years, think of the Wild West, but lasting an awful lot longer.
So into this backdrop, we have a young man, Will Fowler, which I didn't know when I was reading the book originally, that he's an actual real person from history. He's a teenager in Edinburgh, and he decides to go get his university degree in St. Andrews. And, even on the way there, he finds himself in the midst of skullduggery and knife fights, and we don't know what's going on quite. But he's just going up there for a university degree, but adventure comes to meet him immediately.
Yes.
Would you like to do a reading for us? I don't know what bit you have chosen to read, but I would love to hear.
Well, okay, I'm going to read an early bit. He's already had this extremely eventful voyage where he meets someone who's going to become extremely important in the book. But on day one at St. Andrews, he's assaulted by a couple of local citizens because he has stepped on the scorch marks of the Martyrs. These are the kind of ashy, greasy piles left from the pyres where 4 different Protestant martyrs were burned to death, in view of many of the people who were still in St. Andrews. It's not that much later. So he steps on it by accident, and of course he's throttled for being disrespectful. And he says, I don't know about this. I'm from Edinburgh. So he's pretty shaken, and it's day one, he's only just matriculated, thinking, what kind of place is this? And he goes down towards the harbour to have a look at the ruined, sacked cathedral. So I'm going to read a shortened version of this passage in the book. This is Fowler, in old age, writing about himself, aged about 15, 16. The dwellings by the harbour were lowly cottages, turf-roofed, each with its own tiny window. Behind them towered the vast shell of the cathedral, impossible to miss the poverty of one and the ruined splendour of the other. On the green, 2 fishwives picked crab claws off the nets while a younger lassie began repairs. She flicked her wooden shuttle through a gaping rip, paused to inspect, not tighten. 2 more quick passes, and the net was whole again. Would one could repair a rent world so? Her head turned, and eyes of deep dark blue lighted on me. She nodded, neither docile nor wanton. And I smiled back, for she looked fine as life itself. A door to a low dwelling opened, and from it emerged, improbably, a student, threadbare red gown drawn about his shoulders. A poor scholar, I guessed. He glanced at me, then he ducked among the netting and curled his arm round the girl's waist. My fine romance had been conceived and died within 1 minute. When I was able to look again, the student was limping up the brae towards St. Leonard's. I sat cold-arsed on my bollard. The town was hostile, the university packed with grotesques. I was a wee pudge with insufficient Latin, marooned far from hame. The lassie carried on her work, but I could not bear to watch. I looked up where the ruined cathedral windows soared against the sky. The age of idolatry was gone, with all its splendours and corruptions. A gannet rose in the wind. It held its position by the highest arch, then glided forward into the gale, passing through like a white thread drawn through the needle eye. That was enough to release me to rise and walk back through the stricken town, to the sanctuary of my bunk, and to whatever the morn might bring.
I love that. I completely love that.
Whatever the morn might bring, yes.
I have to say, when I was reading it, I believed, just as Will did, that this was the girl that he'd immediately taken a shine to with her boyfriend, or her husband. And I do think you did such an excellent job in this book of putting the reader right inside Will's body and perceiving what he perceives. But this, you can tell that he's taken away with Rose the moment he sees her. And that's what this book does so well. You've got a love story at the heart of it, and some of the most beautiful writing, I think, in it is as there, where Will is trying to put into words his feelings at seeing this girl. Yet it's not just a love story. You balance it so well with the mayhem and the night fights and the piracy and the reaving. Are you mindful of that as you're writing, that that you must keep the action going, the pages turning?
Well, mostly the action just turned up. I mean, he gets on a boat because it was the sensible way for him to go between Edinburgh and St. Andrews, and suddenly there's a storm, and then there's a boy appears from down below the deck who's in trouble and is asked surreptitiously for a loan of his dagger, his dirk. I didn't know this was going to happen, and I thought, oh yeah, of course, that's where that's going to happen. And when he gets to St. Andrews, he's immediately into action because John Knox dies, and there's a student fighting and scuffling, and church goods are needing to be sold off by the dean, and he gets involved in hell. Basically, stuff just kept happening. And I think the person to hold responsible is Robert Louis Stevenson. I read quite a lot of Stevenson when I was 14, 15, 16, and it gave me the idea that a real novel, a proper book, was going to have adventure and excitement and skullduggery, and almost certainly a love story. So that's what I tried to do.
Is it unfair to ask, do you have a favorite character? Because I can tell you that I was so taken with that young man who gets the borrow of gets the loan of Will's dagger. That Lord
yeah,
Scott.
that's a very young Scott of Buchanan. He's going to grow up to be quite somebody. But initially, he's just a 12-year-old boy of some resource, and these two people, his escort, are going to kill him. And Scott becomes a killer very early on, but he's also funny, charming, and clever, and therefore really frightening. But I found his company irresistible. I met him first in Fair Helen, which was set about 8 years later. And I found any scene that he walked into just got 10 times more interesting, because I never knew what he was about, but he was always about something.
Is it difficult not to let such an incandescent character take over every scene he walks into, to take over the entire story? Because he doesn't. It's very well balanced, I thought. But is that a struggle for you to?
Well, I think the only way is to balance it is to have other interesting people who also kind of elbow their way in. And so Fifth Earl of Bothwell, who is really a loose cannon, he kind of as a counterweight for Scott. And of course, Rose Nicholson herself, with her sheer intelligence and a saying of baffling things which he doesn't really understand. She's another character who will tend to take hold of the scene. And his mother, William Fowler's mother, is a ward wife, a moneylender called Janet Fockhart. Fabulous name. And she is quite a commanding figure, as is Scott of Buccleuch's mother, who lives to be 91. It's unbelievable. I think she has about 13 children. So I found the only way to balance out a strong character is to have other ones who will in some way stand up to them.
We have a question from Kath, who is watching us live, saying, she said, I loved the book. Thank you. I was interested in your choice of the title. She says, how did you come to Rose Nicholson as a title? She says.
Well, I initially called it The Scorch Marks of the Martyrs, which I thought was quite a good phrase. But my editor said, the most interesting person is the one at the heart of it, Rose Nicholson. I think you should call it after her. And in this case, I took his advice. Because also she's the most important as far as Will Fowler. She's the most important person there. And she has quite a crucial role, though she's actually often off to the side because she is a girl in very much a male culture. So she can't be at the university. She can't take part, fortunately, in knife fights in dodgy inns. But she is important.
So if for anyone who hasn't yet read it, you have young Will Fowler and Rose's brother Tom are together at the university. I think Tom is ahead of Will in years, but Rose is always there because St. Andrews is a fishing town, so he's always seeing her. So she's very much in the action over the course of the school years. So right at the center of this book, we have these, two young men doing their university degree, but that's just part of it because we go on to see what becomes of Will afterwards. And as you said, his mother is a formidable character. Scott's mother is a formidable character. So is Rose. And I thought you did an excellent job of giving great parts for women in a time where there weren't that many great parts for women in actual society. I thought that was really well done.
Well, that's right. And there were a few exceptional, powerful ones, like Lady Margaret because of her position, but not just that. Her strength of character shines out through history. And Rose, I felt, was a true invention. I believed in her. It was possible for somebody to be that clever, that educated, and that frustrated, because this is going to put her into jeopardy, I realized, which is good from a writer's point of view, that she's going to become accused of being, first too clever for her own good, eventually witchcraft, and necromancy. That's a kind of all-purpose term that they use. And she gets in trouble with a minister who's obsessed by her, who dies suddenly, probably from blood poisoning. But of course, that's put down to witchcraft. So she is in serious trouble. And her jeopardy, of course, really helps the story propel itself forward.
I think you do. Yes, go ahead.
This stuff makes itself up, basically. I do a lot of reading, a lot of thinking about it, and then pretty much scenes suggest themselves, and I pretty much follow behind panting.
That's actually, we have a question from another viewer asking about exactly that. For a question from Lindsay, she said, did you plan the novel closely, or do you just allow these fabulous characters to take you where they want to go?
Okay, well, I did not plan it. I did have 3 characters. I knew about them, that they were going to exist, because they're all based on real people. And I did a lot of reading, a lot of research, and I spent a lot of time walking the streets in Edinburgh and St. Andrews. What's great about those places is the 16th century stuff still visible. You can walk through the places that these people lived in. Helps you believe in it. But the actual story, I only had a bit of guidance from history, particularly the more obscure characters. So I kind of let it make itself up. And I don't know where this stuff comes from. I honestly don't. Because if I knew what was going to happen from start to finish, it would just be like coloring in an exercise book and a little bit tedious. But because I honestly didn't know what was going to happen, I just kept pushing on and waiting to see, and things would just crop up, which would lead to something else, which led to something else. And I tried to stay within the bounds of history and possibility and even likelihood. But something happens. You do depend on the imagination. That's why it's called historical fiction. I guess it's a weird alloy of history and fiction, which comes from the imagination and your knowledge, such as it is, of human beings and how they act and react.
As you know, I think the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction has a younger sibling, which is the Young Walter Scott Prize, which recognizes young writers who are between 11 and 19 years old who want to try writing historical fiction for the first time. If you had one piece of advice for these young writers, or indeed for any writer who wants to try to tackle historical fiction for the first time, what would it be?
Oh, that's a great question, because I do have one, which is, remember that everything that happened in the past happened in the now. Everything that will happen in the future happens in the now. It's exactly the same for them as us. They do not know what's going to happen next. In that sense, they are as modern as us. They're not old-fashioned people living in the past who are pretty stupid. They're not like that at all. So stay present. Remember, it didn't happen in black and white. It happened in color, and things smelled, and they felt the rain. They tasted food. The physical presence was as present as us. And that's what, to me, gives it its real buzz, that they don't know what's going to happen. And as the writer, most of the time, I didn't know what was going to happen. Yeah, stay present.
When I was reading part of this earlier, there was a moment where Will talks about living in these heady times, like natural philosophy, and he's basically, he feels like the most modern man alive. Here he is with the university education, new, vistas of intellectual inquiry are opening up. Science is making everything possible. We don't have to be a slave to, the mysticism of the past and Catholicism as it was then. He feels like a man who couldn't, be more modern.
Yes, well, that's how he felt to himself, as were all his friends. They were the most modern people on the planet. And again, if you're writing historical fiction, I think you've got to keep reminding yourself these are modern people in their minds. And that determined quite a lot of the language I choose to use. I mean, I could have tried to write it in 16th century Scots, but almost nobody could read it, and I couldn't write it. And equally, it'd be absurd to make them language too modern, but I wanted it to be modern enough to feel contemporary, but with sprinkling in little bits of French and Latin and references that could only belong to a different mindset and a different time. And it's that kind of balance that you're translating that time of now into sort of a version of this time as somebody might express themselves now.
You also managed to make this idea of necromancy and people being prosecuted for witchcraft feel very, very present. You've said that the past isn't for those people. It wasn't in black and white. It wasn't in olden times. You make it feel very current. This threat to Rose, she is considered. She's considered to be a heretic. She is in great danger of being literally burned at the stake. It feels terrifying and outrageous, and yet very real.
Yeah, well, people around them believe it, and so it makes the threat real. And she's not above being frightened. She is frightened, but she's also frustrated. Her possibilities in her life are so frustrating. Imagine you are hyper intelligent, you're surrounded by these people who are not, and particularly all these men who kind of rule what you can do so much. It drives her crazy. So sometimes she becomes indiscreet and speaks her mind, and that, of course, is extremely dangerous. So I didn't want to make her a martyr, but she is going to be in serious danger. And of course, Will wants to try and help her and do what he can. But that's where Walter Scott comes in, because he's got connections and he's got plans about how they might be able to get her out of this problem, out of this place to another place. So there's lots of escapes and getaways and stuff like that. I mean, I just got so involved in these people, the four of them, because they function as a four. And I really feel I've been there, and I feel I've sold a cigar case, to John Knox, and I feel I've done all these things. As well, also as a person I'd like to talk about, called George Buchanan, who's one of the elderly people here. George Buchanan was tutor to Mary Queen of Scots, to James VI and First, and also to Montaigne. It's scarcely credible that one person could have done that. He was thought to be the finest Latin scholar and writer in Europe of his time. And of course, my guy, William Fowler, did know him. I couldn't believe it. I found out they did actually know each other.
What
and
a gift.
They were in St Andrews in Edinburgh at the right time. And so once George Buchanan came into scenes, I thought, no, this is really interesting. I think I thought of my father a lot, because he seemed ancient, my dad, when I was young. It was this elderly man in which the Reformation and the Renaissance are kind of at war, because he's a humanist, George Buchanan, but he's also a Calvinist. Mm-hmm. And as I put it, two different salinities, two different oceans kind of seem to be coexisting in his head. And I got very involved in him.
He definitely comes across as a power broker. He can make things happen. And we're not just talking about, when we're talking about Will and Tom and Rose, these aren't just a few people who are near each other in St. Andrews. They are rubbing shoulders with royalty, with the king himself, with the king's tutor, as you say, George Buchanan. And you feel like Scotland is a very small place because, but truly the king, you didn't make that up. The king was in St. Andrews. He was.
Oh yeah. He was at plays, but he came to a poetry group that William Fowler was in, called the Castilian Band of Poets. He was about a 14-year-old poet, the king at this point, and of course they flatter him, but he's very bright, in fact, James, and he knows when he's being flattered, so they have to kind of get real with him, and he drops all that specialness until he walks away from the room, at which point, he's under guard, he's a king. But I love the fact that you got an insecure 14-year-old poet, and my chap is 17 at this point. So in the way they're all young and pretentious and excited and full of themselves, but equally, he is the king, and he's a real historical character. Because Scotland is really small. I had not realised there's about 3,000 households in Edinburgh.
Wow.
3,000. This is the capital of Scotland. That's about 12,000 people, roughly. And maybe another 1,000 down in Leith. But it sounds like this place, and it has amazing buildings and everything, but it's tiny. St. Andrews was probably about 500 households. So of course they knew each other. Of course you passed the king and the chancellor and Lord this and somebody going off to get executed. History happened right in front of you all the time. So from a novelist's point of view, this is great. You can have a character like Will Fowler, who's kind of on the sidelines, but plausibly keeps meeting and associating with these people. It's not that Scotland's classless, but it is very small. So everybody can recognize everybody else.
And you spoke earlier about the turbulence and the instability politically at the time. This is, and you cover it in the book. We talk about the child king. He's literally kidnapped and held in somebody's castle for a year, isn't he?
Yes, yeah. He's kept entirely for his own safety, sort of in inverted commas, in Stirling Castle. All of his, and it is partly his own safety, because other people will want to kill him, and his life gets actually more dangerous once at about 15, he moves to Edinburgh, and he's now, once the regents have all been bumped off, Scotland is run by 4 regents in 12 years, all of whom are murdered. It's a shambles, it really is. But once he becomes king, I've realised he's in more danger, because it's only one man now, and if you kill him, there's a power vacancy. Before they used to kill the regents. They killed each other, the regents. But once you get to the point that there's just one king, he really is in danger.
So can we take it that you will be returning to this period again for another book, I hope?
Well, yes. This book, Rose Nicholson, was meant to be called Padua, and it was meant to involve them all going to Padua, because I discovered those 3 people had actually matriculated in Padua in 1591. The signatures are in the book. And I sent Rose Nicholson off there, because I knew that's where she was going to end up. But in fact, the backstory, how these people met, took half the book. And I was so interested in that, because basically the first half is a campus novel with added knives and crossbows and dodgy things going on.
A lot of knives, yeah.
The second half is kind of a man of the world, trying to be a man in the world. And then what happened was, I had to say to my editor, look, I'm sorry, we're not going to get to Padua in this. Padua will come up. It's all lined up for the next book. And he said, oh, okay, I love this book. But this time, the next book, you've got to get to Padua. And so I promised that I will.
Oh, fantastic. So we will hopefully we will see Rose again. Will she come?
Yeah, well, I think so. I don't think it's given away too much. Yeah.
Brilliant. Is it too difficult for me to ask you, do you have a favorite scene from Rose Nicholson?
Well, one of the ones is a joke, which I rather like. Rose is kind of walking towards them in the fish market, and Tom Nicholson and Fowler and somebody else are talking together, and Tom Nicholson calls out to Rose and says, "Oh, come on in this. We're talking about predestination." And she comes up and says, "I suppose that was inevitable." And I wrote it without having, frankly, with lies. She'd made a joke, and a good joke.
You
Was
give a
that?
lot of really good lines to Rose.
Well, it just kept coming up with them. And
Yeah.
another one about the great ladder of being. And she asked, and Fowler's explaining this to her, feeling rather superior because he's at university and she's not. And eventually she says, "So, what's the ladder propped up on?" And Fowler thinks, "Huh? Nobody in my class has ever raised that question. It's a profound, it's also a joke, but it's a profound joke.
Hmm.
And what it's really saying is there a God that actually underpins this?
Hmm. What's it leaning against?
And that
Exactly.
what's the ladder leaning against? Because it's upright." And that was the image that his tutors had always used, but without asking himself a truly fundamental and also nearly unthinkable question. And at that point, he starts to realize, hang on, she's way brighter than me, and she's brighter even than her brother. And if she says that kind of thing in public, that would be
Hmm.
dangerous.
Trouble.
And
And
that
then he
one,
goes home and writes his first sonnet after that conversation, doesn't he?
yes, he writes a very bad, as he admits.
Yes,
Yes, yes. He's quite funny about his own poetry. He was an adequate poet. He was quite well known. Wrote a long series of poems called Tarantula, same title as Bob Dylan's rather iffy novel. I don't think he'd ever seen a tarantula, but it was about the pains of love.
Yeah.
And he was a noted poet. He was printed properly by the King's publisher. He was in and out the edge of the court, but he wasn't a great poet. But I rather like the fact he kept giving lines and saying, "Yeah, I thought I'd write that one. I just had to cut it." When people say great things to him, and he thinks, "Oh, I must write that down later," but then he forgets.
Yeah. I loved also that in a Reeving episode where they're going on a raid, they're coming back from it, and they say, "Will, you're a poet. Go on and write us a ballad right now about what happened." I thought that was well done. A writer writing a ballad in the middle of a book.
That's right. But he's told to write a border ballad written by Walter Scott. And he
Yeah,
makes a reasonable fist of it. And he's
yeah,
very excited when it gets published and sold. And like all writers, he's very interested. Are people buying my broadsheet?
right. Oh yes, he goes in to find his
Yes,
his
yes. And they sold out, and it said, "You're not going to print more." He said, "No, times have moved on." And he
Oh,
said,
that's
"Oh,
right.
yeah." So,
Right.
yeah, wee jokes like that I enjoyed.
I loved it. Well, tragically, we are out of time. Thank you so much to everyone who came and asked us questions. If you'd like to know more about Andrew's writing, please check out his website, which is here. And if you want to know about the next Walter Scott Prize Shortlist Spotlight, please follow the hashtag on social media or just go to our YouTube channel and subscribe there, and you'll find out what we're doing next. What we're doing next is chatting to Colm Tóibín about his novel, The Magician. That is next Tuesday at 7 p.m. UK time. But please help me say thank you again to Andrew Greig. Andrew, thank you so much for giving us your time this evening.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you very much.
It's great talking to you.
Later.
And to everyone else, thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.